All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Cameron Froude. Cami, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. So Dr. Froude is the founder of Bliss In Being, a healthcare company that provides psychotherapy and coaching to individuals, couples, and families recovering from chronic stress and trauma. Dr. Froude earned her PhD in Human Development and Family Studies at the University of Connecticut and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in family medicine education at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Dr. Froude is an EMDR certified licensed therapist and clinical supervisor. She has over 10 years of experience helping trauma survivors tap into their resilience and thrive in all areas of their life. Cami, thank you so much for taking the time. Before we get going, where are you from originally and where are you currently?
Yes. So I am an East Coast transplant. So I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm now in San Francisco.
Very similar to myself.
Really?
Yeah. I'm born in New York and now I'm over on the West Coast. You know, before we got, I was looking at your website and in your about section, you talk about yourself and your experience. And I found it very, vulnerable. And it really touched me. And I'm sure we'll get to it, but I just appreciated it because I think you share an experience that I certainly could relate to, but we'll get into that. But let's get going here. How the heck did you get into this field?
I know it was, I feel like I just continued to follow little kernels according to what my clients needed. And when I look back, it was really organic unfolding based on just trying to be the absolute best therapist I could be and really wanting to close the gap in my outcomes. And so I just kept learning and growing and finding new information to help that one patient or one client. And then it would turn again and then again and then again.
Yeah. Well, what about before you got there? How did you decide to become a therapist or get into that field in the first place?
Therapist. Yeah, I think I was always someone who I think very broadly liked to see people grow and learn. Ever since I was little, I feel very grateful. I don't have I have other vices, but I don't have like a jealousy gene. I don't have that proclivity. And so when I would see someone in my class get a scholarship or get a really great grade, I would feel really excited for them, particularly if I had helped them in some sort of way. And so from a really early age, I enjoyed seeing people succeed. And it wasn't until I started to see people succeed in spite of something that I started to wonder if I could influence that process and support people in their success in spite of something like a divorce, because I'm thinking I was in middle school. So things that I would see around me, a divorce, the death of a family member, a classmate that I had was removed from her family from Child Protective Services. And I remember just thinking at a really young age, just very, benignly, I guess, how is this person going to do on our math test if they're now in a new home? And just kind of thinking, wow, this person needs extra support, extra help, and also benefiting from that myself. Just like all of us have had difficult times. My parents divorced when I was younger. And my dad had some mental health issues, and I was the beneficiary of help and love and support for my family and from a therapist from a super young age. I started doing therapy when I was 14 and continued with that same therapist until I was about 26.
Holy moly. Why did you start at 14? Because of your parents' divorce?
Divorce, yeah. And, just I would say struggling with that like adolescent development, identity development, sexuality, and ended up having some risk factors that my mom was, really thankfully aware. And I think actually a friend of my cousin's friend's mom was a therapist. And so it felt kind of safe.
Yeah.
And so I started to see that person and then just continued. So yes, I think all in all, it was witnessing resilience, witnessing success, seeing the power of a supportive, loving person in your corner, and then wanting to provide that for others, just as it had been provided for me.
So you, at some point, did you study psychology in undergrad, or how did it?
Yeah, it's so funny. Like, I'm always also so interested in therapist development with this. Some people knew, like, I want to be a therapist. This is 100%. I just knew I wanted to help people grow and succeed. So I started off in elementary ed.
Okay.
And so that was my, and this is definitely not reflective. It shouldn't be of this internship. I think it was my own lack of awareness of how to self-regulate. I went into my first teaching practicum as like a 18 or 19-year-old and just fled. I was like, this is definitely not for me.
I'm out.
Yeah, not for me. And transitioned into human development and family studies, thinking, let me just try to understand this, to try to understand human development as a whole and see where I can fit in.
Yeah.
Then went and got a master's in psychology, another one in marriage and family therapy, and then ended up doing the PhD.
Okay. So help me understand how your experience or experiences of stress, of anxiety, propelled or influenced your movement into helping others with trauma and so forth.
It's interesting. I saw them a bit as parallel for a long time. And I would say only in the last probably 6-7 years have really started to integrate my own experience with my practice. I had to do a lot of unlearning. I was trained in pretty traditional modernist notions of therapy that everything should always be separate. Mm-hmm. And that the client and the therapist should, that should be separate. You really have to track the countertransference and transference. And so I lived like that for a long time. And so I considered them relatively separate. Just for people who maybe not have looked at the About page on my website, I did from a very young age have a lot of anxiety, a ton of anxiety.
No, let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
So you said you kept things separate, meaning what, your life and their life, but to what degree were you cognizant or aware of your own anxiety, your own experiences in a sense?
I would say very, very aware and working really, really hard to manage it and get it under control.
Okay.
And I only really learned that sharing that experience with clients and really integrating that into my work was a huge benefit to my clients. So I was kind of doing that in secret for a really, really long time, thinking that it was actually like how could people trust me to help them if I had anxiety or if I had OCD that was unmanaged. And then finally I started coming out of the shadows, so to speak. And so I just want to thank you for noticing that on my website, because it's newer for me to be doing that.
Yeah.
And it does take a lot of courage. And it helps people to know that.
Well, it humanizes you.
Yes.
I mean, in my perspective, it humanizes you. And I think that it's, to be experiencing or have experienced anxiety, like I certainly have, and it's difficult to separate.
It is.
No, we're not talking about unethically self-disclosing, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about, or I'm talking about, being in the moment and being willing to
Yes.
appropriately, with boundaries, be able to share and be a human.
Yes.
But were you, I guess, were you aware that your anxiety, or to what degree were you aware that it maybe was impacting your clients? Or, you know what I'm saying? Was it?
Yes. So that's the myth of keeping things separate.
Right.
Yeah. So I was trained to keep things separate and tried my hardest, but of course it's all integrated. And I actually was so grateful I did, in just right in the middle of like a lot of really traditional modernist training, which I have a lot of gratitude for. I think I had great training in many senses. I did a postmodern narrative internship.
Wow.
And like dead smack in the middle.
Where did you do that?
Yeah, it's so I did it in Boston at a place called the Home for Little Wanderers, and the very specific program was called Safe at Home, and it was very out of the normal scope, because we actually did in-home family therapy, very intensive, 3 days a week. We were connected to Child Protective Services, so we were working to reintegrate families. And usually that would be like, very structured, behaviorally based, but they did a full narrative approach. And so when I went there, they just turned everything upside down that I had learned. And that's really where I first began to learn integrating self.
Mm-hmm.
You had someone on the podcast who talked about, she's a somatic-based worker massage therapist who works with Bessel van der Kolk. She does a lot of trainings.
Oh, was that Lisa?
Yeah.
Lisa Sky, yeah.
And Sky. And she was talking about just that minute tracking of your body when you're with another person. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of Hikomi therapy, that idea of just like, when another person walks by you, when another person shows up in front of you, what exactly is going on in your nervous system? And instead of separating it, mm-hmm. putting it away, actually trying to attend to it in that moment and recognizing that it might give you some information about the clinical work that you're doing with this family. Mm-hmm. Or it might not be relevant, and that's something you need to work on in your personal therapy, mm-hmm. for example. Mm-hmm.
So very interesting. And that sounds like an awesome internship. How did that sit with you? I mean, you said it kind of turned things on its head.
Yes. Yeah. Shockingly, I was anxious about it. But I think what I learned was that when you have a loving, supportive group of people around you who have faith in your ability to move through difficult things, and this is a behavioral term, but you can do those exposures. And I just continue, was working with a therapist at that time, and she framed it as exposures. She's like, Kimmy, just try it. When they ask you what was coming up for you when you were working with that client, just tell them, just try and work through it and move through the emotions of anxiety. Try to understand what is the negative core cognition that's kind of blocking this sharing? Is it, I have to be perfect to be loved? I have to, I have to be logical to be respected. What is the negative core cognition that's blocking the sharing?
What were they for you? I mean, obviously it might be different in a lot of different instances, but
yeah. I think I definitely was, as someone who lived with OCD and anxiety, I had ideas that, I had to be perfect. I had to be linear and rational in order to be respected and in order to make sense. I had ideas that I inherently had to make up for something. Like I always felt like I was just digging out of this hole. Don't know why, not really sure. Right. But I was always like a couple steps behind, and I was never really behind.
yeah.
It was just like a complete social construct.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. For me, when I got out of grad school and was seeing clients, I felt like I mean, not unlike a lot of new therapists, but I felt like I had to be this own ideal of a therapist that I had constructed. Mm-hmm. And from my own experience as a young kid, feeling like I wasn't smart enough, I felt like I had to, have all the answers. And that drove a lot of the way I was working. And we all know how that works. It backfires, and I got to a point, I was working with young kids, and I got to a young point where I was just able to cut out the BS and just be as human as I could be. And it was such a powerful experience for me. And it really helped.
Definitely. So, yeah, I think, I was a mentor always, told me really far back that it's really important to have a really compelling and important clinical question, because whatever your question is, that's what your conversations are going to be about. That's what the outcomes are going to be about. So you have to have if someone comes in and says, why am I damaged? Right. Then that's what you're going to be talking about. Mm-hmm. And so I always have tried to shift when I go into therapy with a client as the therapist, to ask, like, how can I show up in the clearest sense for their healing? Mm-hmm. Not for my perfection, not for my ego, and it distills our work in a way that's helpful in staying focused in what the goal is and what we're doing. So yeah, I agree. Just going in as pure and human as possible. Mm-hmm.
So this sounds, I mean, obviously this was a pretty a transformative experience for you doing this internship. Mm-hmm. So you came out of that, and then what did you do? What were you working?
Yeah, so then I was finishing my doctoral program, and I think I've always, maybe listeners can relate to this, is having this tension between, am I going to be on the ground doing the work, or am I going to be in an ivory tower doing research? And there was just this tension of kind of the more, let's get down to it and do it, or let's think about it and research and do something more intellectual and propel in that way. So there was always this tension. And so just saying, okay, well, I'm not going to figure it out now. I'm just going to continue to do both. And I did both for a long time, and then finally had to decide. So I was doing full-time clinical work in community-based mental health, and also completing my PhD.
Okay.
Yeah, so kept doing that. And actually it was perfect. I guess one of the things that I've learned is definitely just to keep a toe maybe in all little areas. So if your foot is in clinical work, just try to write a chapter, or just try to write a short story, or go on a podcast, or thankfully, I've been doing full-time trauma work for a long time, and I have never neared burnout. This could be for a lot of reasons. I haven't had, severe health issues. I have a lot of privileges backing that up.
Mhm.
And also, I think it's the diversity a bit of impact can make a difference for therapist resilience.
Right, right. Yeah, I definitely have heard that before, and that makes a lot of sense to me too. So,
Mhm.
when did you found your company?
Bliss In Being.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I I noticed with my clients that when I was in training and then through my doctoral program, I kept getting referrals from primary care doctors, and they were like, a client would come, "Hi, my doctor referred me for therapy because I have stomach aches." I'm like, "Oh, what am I supposed to do about that?" And they said, "Well, the doctor said there's no organic cause, and so they said I should go to therapy." And so I was getting this migraines. And I think this is true for a lot of therapists. Primary care doctors refer us unexplained medical issues that they imagine or they hypothesize have a psychosomatic element. But that doesn't mean we're all equipped to work with people whose trauma and stress is showing up somatically. So anyway, I go through this and my outcomes were not, when I was training, people loved to meet with me, but they still had stomach aches.
Mhm.
And so it caused me to go and pursue, I did a postdoctoral fellowship in medical family therapy. So I really wanted to understand how I could support clients in navigating a really complex medical system,
Wow.
advocating for their needs while also being in therapy to tend to their somatic issues. And so I feel like that fellowship taught me that. It's a wonderful fellowship for people who are interested in doing that. It's through the University of Colorado School of Medicine. And you are a fellow, it's paid, and you're a fellow in a primary care center.
Nice.
And what you learn is you learn how to integrate into a medical office. And then the coolest part is you teach medical residents about the psychosocial aspects of medicine.
Mhm.
And so you would go into an office with a medical resident and you would work together. It was really amazing. This then led over to a job where I was actually working to build a medical family therapy internship for therapists, and then also a residency program that was brand new through UCSF. Wanted to build a behavioral health curriculum, and they wanted to do integrated behavioral health in their clinic. So I kind of jumped over into medical family therapy really hardcore in terms of supporting institutions really in building programs for integrated behavioral health. So like that client who needs to have the pap smear and also has vaginismus, that can happen like when those terms would be known. It's so that that can happen when you have an integrated behaviorist there. Right. So when you're working together, so just kind of teaching those things and teaching systems, medical systems, how to integrate behavioral health. And then I decided, okay, I think I want to do this on my own. I had launched that, the behavioral health curriculum at that residency. I had got my fellowship training and thought, okay, I think I'm equipped to go ahead and support people on my own. And that's how Bliss In Being was founded.
Nice. Wow. Yeah. What a rich background you have.
It's been fun.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Been really fun.
So, all right. Talk to us about Bliss In Being. Who do you serve? Who is your ideal client?
Yes. So I work with individuals and couples and families where one or more members has a traumatic event that they're working through. So this is trauma therapy with individuals. I'm an EMDR trained therapist, EMDR certified therapist, I should say. And I think most good trauma therapists integrate a lot of modalities to tailor to what clients need. Internal family system, somatic experiencing, just figuring out what does someone need in this moment and then using it. And then the Were you going to ask something? Oh.
No.
Okay. And then the really cool thing that I didn't expect, but as a marriage and family therapist, people interestingly assume you're going to do marriage therapy. Good assumption. And so I started getting all these couples where one member had a trauma history and the other one didn't.
Interesting.
And they're so lost, and they love each other so much. And it felt like a cultural distinction, actually, like the culture of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And the other person just like had no idea, like they just hadn't experienced trauma, like lowercase or uppercase.
Right.
And it was causing major issues in the relationship. And so I've started working with couples more and more who are trying to navigate building a relationship through trauma. And then, of course, families, kind of the same thing.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I mean, I can imagine what that might look like when one partner has experienced trauma and the other hasn't. But can you maybe share an example, get a little more specific of what you've seen? Obviously, with
confidentiality.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it has been as far reaching as neither partner had experienced and I'm just want to specify, I mean, if we define trauma as, an event that surpasses the ability to cope, most everyone has had at least a couple of experiences with that.
Right.
So, I just want to specify, I'm talking about a traumatic event where the capacity to cope was overcome for a long period of time.
Got it.
So not, most people could say like, yeah, there was this one time I was bullied and I started crying and and then 10 minutes later they were okay because they were with their teacher. Okay. I just want to say that. Anyway, so it just is spanning from neither partner really experiencing a traumatic event, and then one partner is held up at gunpoint at an ATM. And then all of a sudden in that one moment, they don't have a shared history anymore.
Yep.
In that way. And I think acute stages of trauma, couples figure it out, right? Like, my partner just got held up at gunpoint. I need to take a couple of days off. I'm going to accompany that person to the doctor. But then when that person doesn't recover and they move into PTSD is when things get harder, because it becomes chronic. And that's a more difficult thing for a partner who hasn't experienced trauma or PTSD to understand. So now you have a partner with a chronic illness, hopefully that we're going to eradicate, but it's now, you're now in a partner with a chronic illness. And what does that mean? How do you want to show up in that, et cetera, et cetera. And then all the way on the other side where one partner has developmental trauma. Mm-hmm. So they were abused throughout major developmental milestones and the other partner was not. So something as simple as, hey, do you want to go out for dinner tonight? The other partner says, no, I'm not really in the mood. That partner takes it. It feels like a rejection, right, based on an unhealed attachment, and explaining that and trying to help the other person understand, like, this is not just your partner being difficult. Mm-hmm. This is actually a ruptured attachment that we can work on, we can heal, but just know it's not like your partner being finicky one day. And also, just because we have a name for it doesn't mean it can continue on and on with enabling. Right. Kind of both and.
Wow, very intense. What do you think allows you to work in that context, in that setting? What do you think makes you effective?
So many years of DBT. I think the more distress you can hold, the better you can be as a therapist. And maybe not as a person, but it's definitely helped me a lot. My threshold, when I was especially, an adolescent, young adult, it was so low. I was just so anxious and worried and all the things. And so as the years went on, the distress tolerance increased. Also, as you get older, you experience your own trials and tribulations. I had a parent die of alcoholism last year, and you learn how to hold dialectics. You just learn how to honor your parent who died of mental illness and do the laundry and make an English muffin and show up for work. It's, like we're doing it now. We have a war going on and we're still in this podcast. We're still getting up. It's holding all the complexity and learning how to do that. That's been the key for me.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Cami, as we wind down here, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So you can go on my website. That's a really great place. Blissinbeing.com. You can also just put my name into Google. My cell phone is there. Just reach out to me. A lot of people just text me and reach out to me. I love that. So yeah. All
right. And how about a go-to book recommendation, whether trauma related or not, or whatever? What would you share?
Yes. So I would say the mind-gut connection.
Mind-gut connection.
It's called the mind-gut connection, how the hidden conversation within our bodies impacts our mood, our choices, and our health. You don't have to write all that down if you just type in the mind-gut connection. Sure. But it is the amount of people I see with gastrointestinal issues it's the number one complaint. Really? Yes, it's huge. Either constipation, stomach pains, and then you kind of get into like the pelvic pain area.
Awesome.
And it's very, very connected to mood.
Wow.
Yeah. Awesome. A lot of connections there. Neurobiological.
Look, you are so inspiring. And like I said, your background is just crazy rich. I mean, it's awesome. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
You're so awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate that. All right. We'll be in touch.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.